A study in grief. Of the many strange and varied cases which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes was called upon to investigate during our long association, none presented at its outset a more uniform surface of commonplace tragedy than that which I have inscribed in my notes as the affair of Colonel Carruthers. It was a bleak morning in late November, and the fog, a greasy yellow shroud, hung so thick and low over the city that the lamps in Baker Street were still burning at 10 o'clock, each a bleared and ghostly eye in the gloom. I had myself been in a despondent mood, for the papers were full of little but political squabbles and the dreary march of commerce, offering no fodder for the peculiar appetites of my companion. Holmes, for his part, had been in a state of profound inertia for the better part of a week. He had alternated between scraping mournful and disconnected airs upon his violin, and pacing the confines of our sitting-room like a caged panther, his brow furrowed, his hands clasped behind his back. The formidable energy which, when directed upon a problem, could unravel the most tangled skeins of human wickedness, had turned inwards, consuming him in a black mood of intellectual starvation. "Watson, the world grows dull," he had remarked no more than an hour before, flinging himself into his armchair. "The criminal classes have lost all enterprise and originality. Where are the great villains of yesteryear? Where is the audacity, the flair, the touch of the bizarre, which elevates a crime from the sordid to the truly remarkable?" I had murmured some placating response, but my heart sank, for I knew these moods of old. It was at such times that he was most likely to vex our long-suffering landlady, Mrs. Hudson, with some malodorous chemical experiment, or, worse still, resort to the 7% solution against which I had so often protested. It was with a sense of profound relief, therefore, that I heard the sharp peal of our doorbell, followed shortly by the tread of a visitor upon the stair. Holmes sat up, a flicker of interest in his keen grey eyes. "A client, Watson, and if I am not mistaken, a young lady in considerable distress. Her step is hesitant, yet driven by an urgent purpose. She has paused twice upon the landing, as if to compose herself. A matter of some delicacy, I should surmise." He had scarcely finished his pronouncement when Mrs. Hudson opened the door to admit our visitor. She was a woman of perhaps 24, tall and elegantly dressed in mourning attire that was clearly of the finest quality, yet worn with a distracted air. Her face, framed by dark coiling hair, was pale and tear-stained, but her chin was held at a determined angle, and her blue eyes, though reddened, held a spark of resolute fire. She clutched a small reticule in her gloved hands with such intensity that her knuckles were white. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling contralto. My friend rose and bowed with an air of graciousness that he could assume so well when dealing with women. "I am he, and this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray draw up to the fire, madam, for you are chilled to the bone. You have come to us in some trouble, I perceive." "The greatest trouble imaginable, sir," she replied, sinking into the chair he indicated. "My name is Eleanor Carruthers. I was the daughter of Colonel James Carruthers, late of Her Majesty's 34th Regiment of Foot." Her voice broke on the last words, and she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Holmes waited with a patient, abstracted air, his long, thin fingers steepled before him. "The newspapers have been full of your father's tragic demise, Miss Carruthers," he said in a gentle tone. "The police, I believe, are satisfied that he took his own life." "The police are fools!" she cried, her composure shattering in a blaze of anger and grief. "They see what is simple, What is convenient? They see a locked door and a pistol in his hand, and they close their books. But I know my father, Mr. Holmes. He was a man of iron will and unshakable principle. He was stern, yes, and we had our differences, but he was not a coward. He would never ever have abandoned his post in such a manner. Holmes leaned forward. His lethargy vanished, replaced by the familiar hawk-like intensity that signalled the game was afoot. "Tell me everything, Miss Carruthers," he said. "Omit no detail, however trivial it may seem to you. The smallest fact may be the one upon which a whole case turns." And so, as the yellow fog swirled and eddied against our window panes, we listened to the first chapter of a story as strange and as dark as any that had ever been unfolded within the four walls of our Baker Street lodging. The locked room at Blackwood Manor. Miss Carruthers took a steadying breath, her narrative gaining in coherence as she marshalled her thoughts. "My father retired from the army 5 years ago," she began. "He purchased Blackwood Manor, a small but rather ancient estate in the quietest part of Surrey. He was not an easy man to live with, Mr. Holmes. His years in India had instilled in him a discipline that bordered on the tyrannical. Our household ran on military time. He was a man of rigid habits, and he held a grievance against me." She hesitated, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. "2 years ago, I wished to marry a young gentleman, a Mr. Armitage, who had served under my father as a subaltern. My father forbade the match in the strongest possible terms. He would give no reason other than to say that Captain Armitage was not a man of honour. It was a terrible accusation, for the captain is the very soul of integrity. It caused a great rift between us. Though I continued to live under his roof, our relations were strained. I did not break off my engagement, but I respected my father's wishes enough to postpone any wedding." "And Captain Armitage?" Holmes interjected. "He has been a pillar of strength, sir. He felt the slight keenly, but urged me to be patient with my father. He visits the manor often, and was, I believe, the only man my father still considered a friend, despite his harsh words." "Interesting," murmured Holmes. "Pray continue." "The tragedy occurred 3 days ago. My father took all his meals in his study, a habit he had adopted over the past year. He had become more and more reclusive. At 9 o'clock in the evening, our butler Jennings took him his customary glass of brandy and a biscuit. My father took the tray at the door, wished him good night, and locked the door from the inside. Jennings heard the key turn in the lock and the bolt slide home. Those were the last words anyone heard my father speak. The study is on the ground floor, I presume? Yes, at the back of the house, overlooking the rose garden. It has but one door, leading into the main hall, and one large window, which was found bolted from the inside. The chimney is far too narrow for a man to pass through. "So we have a hermetically sealed room," said Holmes, a glint of pleasure in his eyes. "There is nothing that stimulates the mind so much as a classic puzzle of this nature. What happened next?" "In the morning, when he did not answer his valet's call, we became alarmed. Jennings, the valet, and I went to the door. It was still locked and bolted. We knocked and called, but there was no response. A dreadful fear came over me. We sent for the village constable and a blacksmith. It took them the better part of an hour to force the heavy oak door. When we finally gained entry, we found him." Her voice faltered again. I pushed a glass of water towards her, and she took it with a grateful nod. "He was slumped in his large leather armchair by the cold fireplace," she continued. His service revolver was on the floor beside his right hand. He had been shot through the right temple. The local doctor and later the police surgeon declared that the wound was consistent with a self-inflicted shot. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing was out of place. The police concluded it was a simple case of suicide brought on by a fit of melancholy. And you do not agree? I cannot. My father, despondent. He was as rigid and unbending as the oak tree outside his window. He faced down a dozen ambushes in the Khyber Pass without flinching. He was not the sort of man to be defeated by a fit of melancholy. And there is more, Mr. Holmes, something the police dismissed as irrelevant. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed upon my friend's face. For the past 6 months, my father received a letter every Tuesday, without fail. It was always in the same cheap envelope, with a London postmark addressed in a spidery, almost illegible hand. After reading this letter, he would lock himself away, and his temper, always formidable, would be black for the rest of the day. The day of his death was a Tuesday. The letter had arrived that morning. And this letter? Was it found? No, we searched the study thoroughly. Every Tuesday's letter was burned. We found the charred remains of that day's envelope in the fireplace grate, but the letter itself was utterly consumed. So, a weekly tormentor, Holmes mused, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. A blackmailer, perhaps, or an old enemy. This certainly adds a complexion to the case that the Surrey Constabulary has overlooked. You said nothing was out of place. Are you quite certain? Think, Miss Carruthers, the smallest detail. A scent, an object moved, a sound half heard. The young woman closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. For a full minute, the only sounds in the room were the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the soft hiss of the gaslight. There was one thing, she said at last, opening her eyes. It is so trivial I hardly dare mention it. On his desk, my father kept a small, ornate brass box, which he brought back from India. It was a gift from a Maharaja, he said. He kept his cigars in it. The box was always kept in the centre of his desk blotter. But when we found him, it had been moved. It was sitting on the corner of the desk, almost at the very edge. Moved, you say? Holmes's voice was sharp. Was it open or closed? It was closed. And did you or anyone else touch it? No, sir. I noticed it immediately because it was so contrary to his precise habits. But in the horror of the moment, I thought little of it, and the police paid it no heed. Sherlock Holmes sprang to his feet, his eyes shining with a feverish light. His period of lethargy was well and truly over. Miss Carruthers, you have done exceedingly well, he declared, pacing back and forth. You have presented me with a case that has at least 2 features of interest: the weekly letters and the displaced cigar box. The problem is one of singular difficulty, and yet it is one of singular beauty. We are dealing with a mind of no common order, Watson. A villain who can kill a man in a locked room and make it appear a suicide is a foeman worthy of our steel. He turned back to our client. I shall be delighted to look into this matter for you. Dr. Watson and I will catch the 1:15 train to Surrey from Waterloo. I should be obliged if you would meet us at the station there. Do not speak of my involvement to anyone. Not the police, not your staff, and not, he added with a peculiar emphasis, Captain Armitage. I understand, Mr. Holmes. Oh, thank you. You have given me the first glimmer of hope I have had in these dark days. With a final grateful look, she took her leave. As the sound of her cab faded into the foggy street, Holmes turned to me, rubbing his long, thin hands together in satisfaction. "Watson, the game is afoot," he cried. "Get your hat and coat. We have a journey to make and a puzzle to solve that would have baffled the combined wits of Scotland Yard for a decade." At the scene of the crime. The journey to Surrey was a short one, and by 3 o'clock our cab was rolling up the gravelled drive of Blackwood Manor. It was a grim, grey stone building of considerable age, with mullioned windows and a host of twisted chimneys that clawed at the damp sky. A profound silence hung over the place, broken only by the cawing of rooks in the skeletal branches of the ancient elms that surrounded it. Miss Carruthers met us at the door, her face wan in the fading afternoon light. "I have followed your instructions, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. "No one knows of your coming." "Excellent," he replied, stepping into a large, dark-panelled hall. "I wish first to see the room in question. Let it be exactly as it was when the police finished their examination." She led us down a corridor to a heavy oak door, which now stood ajar, the splintered wood around the lock bearing mute testimony to the force that had been used to open it. Holmes paused on the threshold, his keen eyes sweeping over every detail of the room before him. It was a sober, masculine chamber, lined from floor to ceiling with books on military history and campaign strategy. A large mahogany desk stood before the tall, bolted window, and opposite it was a stone fireplace with a high mantelpiece, the grate filled with grey ash. In the centre of the room stood the high-backed leather armchair where the unfortunate colonel had met his end. A dark, ugly stain marred the carpet beside it. The air was cold and musty, with the faint, cloying scent of stale brandy and old leather. Holmes entered the room as a botanist might enter a rare conservatory, with an expression of intense, almost reverent concentration. He produced a large magnifying glass from his pocket and began his examination at the door, scrutinizing the shattered lock and the heavy bolt. "A formidable barrier, Watson," he remarked. "No key could have turned this lock from the outside, nor could the bolt have been shot without a hand on the inside. Our murderer did not enter or leave this way after the door was secured." He moved to the window, running his fingers along the heavy brass bolt. "And this is equally secure. The paint is old and unbroken. It has not been forced. The chimney, as Miss Carruthers observed, is a relic of a bygone age, suitable only for a climbing boy." He took a small tape measure from his pocket and made a series of rapid calculations, murmuring the figures to himself. His attention then turned to the room itself. On his hands and knees he crawled about the floor, his lens passing over every inch of the carpet, the skirting boards, and the legs of the furniture. He paid particular attention to the area around the desk and the fireplace. For my part, I could see nothing but a little dust and the grim stain upon the rug. "Ah!" he exclaimed suddenly, pointing to a spot near the hearth. "What do you make of this, Watson?" I stooped to look. Embedded in the thick pile of the Persian rug were a few minute grains of a coarse reddish-brown powder, almost like brick dust. "Some form of snuff, perhaps," I ventured. No, the texture is wrong. It is more granular. And observe, there is a faint, almost imperceptible scent clinging to it. Something aromatic. Eastern, I fancy." He carefully collected a few grains into a small envelope, which he sealed and placed in his pocketbook. He rose and moved to the desk. He examined the blotter, the pen stand, the neat stacks of paper. Then his gaze fell upon the brass cigar box, which now sat at the corner. He did not touch it, but circled it slowly, studying it from every angle with his lens. It was a beautiful piece of Indian craftsmanship, about 8 inches long and 4 wide, intricately carved with figures of gods and animals. Holmes peered intently at the lid, then at the small lock, and finally at the desk surface around it. "Miss Carruthers," he said, turning to our client, who had been watching his every move with breathless anxiety. "You are certain that this box was in the centre of the desk?" "Absolutely certain, Mr. Holmes." It was his unvarying habit. "And did your father have any enemies whom you know of? Anyone from his past in India?" She shook her head. "He rarely spoke of his time there. He said it was a closed chapter of his life. I know he was involved in the Second Afghan War and received a commendation for bravery, but he would never discuss the details." Holmes nodded, his expression grim. He returned his attention to the fireplace, sifting through the cold ashes with the tip of his walking stick. He uncovered the charred remains of the envelope Miss Carruthers had mentioned, and several lumps of half-burnt paper which had clearly been letters. "Your father was a methodical man, it seems," he said. "He burned his correspondence, but not all of it." He carefully extracted a small, almost completely burnt fragment. On it I could just make out a few words in a faint, spidery script. "Pay for what you did at Kandahar." "Kandahar!" I exclaimed. "Precisely, Watson." Holmes's face was alight with excitement. "The plot thickens. Our colonel had a skeleton in his regimental closet, and it seems it has come back to rattle its bones. The weekly letters were not from a common blackmailer, but from someone seeking revenge for an old wrong." He stood up and dusted the ash from his fingers. "I believe I have seen all that this room has to show me. Now I should like to have a word with your butler, Jennings." The butler was an elderly, dignified man with a mournful face, who had been in the colonel's service for 20 years. He confirmed his mistress's account of delivering the brandy and hearing the door locked and bolted. "Did the colonel seem unusual in any way that evening?" Holmes asked. "He was quieter than usual, sir. His face was like a thundercloud. It was always so on a Tuesday after that letter arrived. He seemed burdened, if you take my meaning." "And the tray? Did you retrieve it in the morning?" "Yes, sir. It was just inside the door, where he always left it. The glass was empty, the biscuit eaten." "One final question, Jennings. Are you aware of any visitors to the house on the day of the colonel's death? Anyone at all?" The butler hesitated. "There was one man, sir, a peddler of sorts, an Indian gentleman, very old and bent, with a long white beard. He was selling trinkets and spices. He came to the tradesman's entrance in the afternoon. The cook bought some curry powder from him." "An Indian peddler?" Holmes's voice was sharp with interest. "Did you see him yourself?" "Only from a distance, sir, as he was leaving. A poor, shuffling old fellow. He couldn't be of any importance, surely." "Everything is of importance until it is proved otherwise," Holmes retorted. "Thank you, Jennings, that'll be all." As the butler withdrew, Holmes turned to me, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. "An Indian peddler, Watson. A spidery script mentioning Kandahar, grains of a mysterious Eastern powder, and a displaced Indian cigar box. Do you not see the threads beginning to weave themselves into a pattern?" "It is all a black mystery to me," I confessed. "Of course it is, but it is a mystery with a solution. Our next step is a conversation with Captain Armitage. I fancy he may be able to shed some light upon the dark doings at Kandahar." The testimony of the captain. Captain Philip Armitage was a man who, at first sight, seemed to justify Miss Carruthers' high opinion of him. He was a tall, broad-shouldered fellow of about 30, with a handsome sun-bronzed face, a steady blue eye, and a frank, open manner. He received us in the drawing-room, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Mr. Holmes," he said, after Miss Carruthers had made the introductions, "I had no idea Eleanor had consulted you. Is this wise? The police were quite satisfied." "The police are easily satisfied, Captain," said Holmes coolly. "Miss Carruthers is not. She believes her father was murdered." Armitage started, his face paling beneath its tan. "Murdered? Good heavens, man, that's impossible. The room was locked from the inside. I saw it myself. It was a clear case of suicide. A tragic, dreadful business, but suicide nonetheless." "You were here on the morning the body was discovered?" "I was. Eleanor sent for me at once. I helped to force the door. I saw the Colonel exactly as she must have described." A shadow passed over his handsome features. It was a ghastly sight, to see a man like him, a man I respected above all others, brought to such an end. "You served under him in Afghanistan, I believe." Holmes's voice was casual, but his eyes were fixed on the captain's face. "I did, for 3 years. He was the finest commanding officer a young soldier could wish for. Brave, decisive, and fair. He saved my life on 2 occasions." "You were at the siege of Kandahar with him?" At the mention of the name, a subtle change came over the captain. A flicker of something, was it fear or anger, passed through his eyes before being instantly suppressed. "Yes," he said, his voice a little strained. "We were both there. The Colonel's record from that campaign is impeccable," Holmes continued smoothly. "But war is a messy business. Sometimes things happen that do not find their way into the official reports. Was there any incident at Kandahar, any unpleasantness that might have created a lifelong enemy for the Colonel?" Armitage rose and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening grounds. "These are strange questions, Mr. Holmes. I cannot imagine what you are driving at. The Colonel was a man of the highest honour. He had no enemies, save for the Queen's." "And yet," Holmes pressed, "someone was sending him weekly letters that caused him great distress. Letters that spoke of revenge for something that happened at Kandahar." He produced the charred fragment from his pocketbook and held it out. The captain stared at the scrap of paper as if it were a viper. He did not take it, but he could clearly read the damning words. His composure, for the first time, seemed to slip. "I know nothing of this," he said, his voice hoarse. "Nothing at all." "Captain Armitage," Holmes said, his tone suddenly as hard as steel. "A man's life has been taken. His daughter's peace of mind is at stake. This is not a time for misplaced loyalties. I must know what happened at Kandahar." The captain turned from the window, his face grim. He seemed to be wrestling with some internal conflict. "Mr. Holmes," he said finally, "what I am about to tell you, I have never spoken of to another soul. I do so only because I see that you are determined and because I care for Eleanor more than anything in this world. The Colonel, he made one mistake in his career, a terrible mistake." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "We were defending a small, isolated fort outside the main city. Rations were low, morale was shattered, and we were surrounded by an overwhelming force. The Colonel held us together by sheer force of will. With us was a native merchant, a man named Qasim, who had acted as a guide for the British forces. He was entrusted with the regimental pay chest, a considerable sum in gold sovereigns. One night, Qasim disappeared, and the pay chest disappeared with him. It was a devastating blow. "He deserted?" I asked. "So it seemed." The colonel was enraged. He declared Qasim a traitor and a thief. A few days later, one of our patrols captured a man they believed to be Qasim, hiding in a nearby village. The man swore he was innocent, that he was Qasim's cousin, but the resemblance was strong, and one of our sepoys identified him. The colonel, under the pressure of the siege, convened a drumhead court-martial. The man was found guilty and he was shot as a traitor. And was he the right man? Holmes's voice was quiet. Armitage shook his head slowly. 2 days after the execution, the real Qasim was captured by another British column 50 miles away. He still had the pay chest. He had not deserted, he had been trying to get the gold to safety. It was all a ghastly mistake. The man we shot was an innocent farmer. A heavy silence fell upon the room. The colonel was horrified, Armitage continued, his voice low. He had condemned an innocent man to death. He reported the matter to his superiors, of course, but in the chaos of the war, the affair was hushed up. It was deemed bad for morale. The official record states only that the pay chest was recovered. The execution was never mentioned. But the colonel never forgave himself. It was the one stain on his honor. "And the family of the executed man?" Holmes asked. "Did they know what had happened?" "I believe they were told he was killed in the crossfire. They were a poor family. There was a wife, and I think a young son." "A son?" Holmes repeated softly. "A son who might have grown up nursing a grievance, waiting for the day he could exact his revenge. Thank you, Captain. You have been most helpful." We took our leave shortly after, leaving the captain to his troubled thoughts. As our cab rattled towards the station, Holmes was unusually silent, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "we have our motive. A vendetta 40 years in the making. A son's revenge for a father's unjust death. The question remains, how did he carry it out? How did he strike down the colonel in a room bolted and locked from within? That is the heart of the matter." "And the Indian peddler?" I asked. "Do you suppose he was the avenger?" "It is more than likely, Watson. It is more than likely. Our next task is to find this mysterious visitor. And for that," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "we must dive into the great cesspool of London where all the strange and desperate characters of the Empire eventually wash up. I have a feeling a visit to a certain disreputable opium den in the East End may be in order." The man with the twisted lip. For 2 days, Holmes vanished from my sight. He sent a brief telegram on the first morning which read simply, "Am on the scent. Do not wait up." I knew his methods of old and understood that he had likely adopted one of his numerous disguises and plunged into the labyrinthine underworld of London's docklands. I spent the time rereading the accounts of the Kandahar campaign, but found nothing that shed any further light on the unofficial tragedy that Captain Armitage had recounted. It was on the third night, as a cold rain lashed against our windows, that the door flew open and Holmes strode in. At first I did not recognize him. He was transformed into a stooped and wizened Lascar sailor with a face stained the colour of walnut, a scraggly grey beard, and a shambling gait. He threw a small dusty bundle onto the table before shrugging off his disguise. "Aha, Watson!" he cried, his eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. "I have him, or rather, I have his lair. Our mysterious peddler is not so mysterious after all, once one knows where to look." "Good heavens, Holmes!" I exclaimed. "Where have you been?" "In the belly of the beast, my dear fellow. I have haunted the doss houses and taverns where the men of the East congregate. I have smoked pipes of the blackest shag in the company of spies, smugglers, and forgotten soldiers. And I have listened. It is amazing what one can learn by simply listening. My inquiries about an elderly Indian peddler selling spices eventually led me to a name: Sanjay. A man known in the area, but one who keeps to himself. And more importantly, they gave me an address." "You have found him?" "I have found where he lives. A squalid tenement building off the commercial road. But there is a complication. The man is a recluse, and he has a visitor. For the last 2 days, a well-dressed gentleman has been seen calling at his room. A gentleman, Watson, who matches the description of our handsome Captain Armitage." I sprang from my chair. "Armitage? But what possible connection could he have with this Sanjay?" "That, my dear Watson, is what we are about to find out. The captain is with him now. I saw him enter the building not an hour ago. We must go at once. There is not a moment to lose. The final act of this drama is about to be played out, and I would not miss it for the world." Within minutes, we were in a hansom cab, rattling eastwards through the rain-swept, gaslit streets. The glamour and bustle of the West End gave way to the grim poverty and squalor of the docklands. Our cabby drew up at the end of a narrow, ill-lit alley. "This is it, Watson," Holmes whispered, pulling the collar of his coat up. "Tread softly and have your service revolver ready. We are dealing with a desperate man." The tenement building was a rotting hulk, smelling of damp, decay, and boiled cabbage. We crept up the creaking stairs, guided by a faint line of yellow light that shone from under a door on the third-floor landing. As we drew near, we could hear the murmur of voices from within. One was old and cracked, speaking in a halting, accented English. The other was the clear, cultured baritone of Captain Armitage. Holmes put a finger to his lips and gestured for me to listen. We pressed our ears to the thin wooden door. "Cannot go on like this, Sanjay," the captain was saying, his voice taut with emotion. "You have had your revenge. The colonel is dead. It is time to end this. Think of Eleanor." "He paid," the old man's voice rasped. "He paid for my father's life. He sat in his fine house for 40 years while my mother starved. He paid with his fear. Every week my letter. Every week a reminder of the innocent blood on his hands. And now he has paid with his life." "But it was murder," Armitage cried. "A cunning, cowardly murder. I helped you because I believed the colonel should be brought to justice, not assassinated by some devilish trick." "Justice?" the old man sneered. "There is no justice for men like us from men like him. I gave him justice, the justice of Kandahar, an eye for an eye." "And the money, Sanjay? What of my money? I have paid you a fortune to keep silent about my own part in this. I was a fool, a weak, greedy fool. But I will not be a party to murder." Holmes chose his moment. With a sudden, violent kick, he shattered the flimsy lock, and we burst into the room. The scene before us was worthy of a painter's canvas. The room was bare and squalid, lit by a single oil lamp that cast long, dancing shadows. In the centre stood Captain Armitage, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. Before him, cowering in a rickety chair, was a small, wizened Indian man with a twisted, scarred lip and malevolent, burning eyes. This was not the stooped, shuffling peddler the butler had described, but a man filled with a viperous energy. "Holmes," Armitage gasped. "So, Captain," my friend said, his voice dangerously soft as he stepped into the room, "it seems you have played a deeper game than we thought. Not just a lovelorn suitor, but an accomplice and a blackmailer's victim, all in one." Before Armitage could reply, the man Sanjay let out a guttural cry and dived for something on the table. It was a long, curved knife that glittered in the lamplight. But Holmes was too quick for him. My friend's foot shot out, catching the man's wrist and sending the knife clattering into a corner. In the same movement, he seized the man by the collar and pinned him against the wall. "The game is up, Sanjay," Holmes hissed. "Your vendetta is over." He turned his cold grey eyes upon the trembling captain. "And as for you, sir, you have a great deal of explaining to do. I suggest you begin at once, for you stand on the brink of the gallows." The confession. Captain Armitage collapsed into a chair, his handsome face buried in his hands. His bravado and composure had utterly deserted him, leaving behind a broken and terrified man. Sanjay, meanwhile, stood rigid in Holmes's grasp, his dark eyes filled with a silent, burning hatred. "Let him go, Holmes," I said, my hand on my pistol. "He is no threat now." Holmes released the man with a contemptuous shove. Sanjay stumbled back but remained silent, a venomous statue in the corner of the squalid room. "Now, Captain," Holmes said, turning his full attention to Armitage. "Your story, from the beginning, and I would advise you not to prevaricate." With a ragged sob, the captain began his confession. "It is true," he stammered. "I knew about the execution. The colonel confided in me years ago in a moment of weakness. He was tormented by it. But there was more to the story, something I kept from you." He lifted his head, his eyes filled with shame. "The pay chest. When the real Qasim was found, not all the gold was recovered. A small portion was missing. Suspicion fell upon the sepoys, but nothing was ever proven. The truth is, I took it. I was young, foolish, and deeply in debt. I saw my chance, and I took a handful of sovereigns. It was a despicable act, and it has haunted me ever since." "So your honour is not so spotless after all," Holmes remarked dryly. "Years later," Armitage went on, his voice barely a whisper, "I ran into Sanjay here in London. I recognized him from a photograph the colonel had once shown me of the executed man's family. He was the son. He had spent his life searching for the truth about his father's death. He found me, and he knew somehow, I don't know how, about my own theft. He threatened to expose me, to ruin my career and my engagement to Eleanor. He used me. He used you to gain information about the colonel's habits, his house, his routine." Holmes finished for him. "And you paid him for his silence." "Yes," Armitage admitted. He began sending the letters to the colonel, tormenting the old man. "I begged him to stop, but he was consumed by his quest for revenge. Then he told me his plan. He said he had a way to frighten the colonel into a confession. He swore no harm would come to him. I was a coward. I was terrified of exposure. I told him about the study, the locked door, the colonel's precise habits. I even told him about the Indian cigar box." He looked up, his face a picture of misery. "But I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I did not know he intended to kill him. I thought it was just a cruel prank to terrify the man. When I saw the colonel's body, I was horrified. I have not slept a full night since." Holmes listened to this sordid tale with an expression of cold disdain. "You have been a fool, Captain Armitage, and a knave. Your cowardice has led directly to a man's death. You have betrayed the woman you claimed to love and the commander who saved your life. However, I am inclined to believe that you were a tool, not the principal agent. The mind behind this crime belongs to this gentleman here." He wheeled around to face Sanjay. "It was a most ingenious plot, I must admit. One of the most remarkable I have ever encountered. To kill a man in a hermetically sealed room is a feat of the highest order. But you made one small mistake. You could not resist a touch of the dramatic. You moved the cigar box." The Indian's lip curled in a sneer, but he said nothing. "It was the one detail that did not fit," Holmes continued, his voice taking on the didactic tone of a lecturer. "The one discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony of crime. Why move the box? It served no purpose in the suicide narrative. Therefore, it must have served a purpose in the murder. It was the key. When I combined that with the grains of reddish powder, the mention of an Indian peddler, and the story of Kandahar, the truth, in its bizarre and terrible entirety, began to dawn upon me." He stepped forward, his eyes boring into Sanjay. "You came to the house disguised as a shuffling peddler. You sold spices to the cook, establishing your presence in a harmless capacity. But your true purpose was the study. You knew the colonel was a man of habit. You knew he would be in his chair after dinner. But how to get your weapon into the locked room?" Holmes paused for dramatic effect. "You used the colonel's own precision against him. He had a secret, known only to a few. A secret you learned from Armitage. The ornate brass cigar box was not merely a container. It was a trick box, a cunning piece of Indian artistry. And it contained not cigars, but a deadly surprise." He turned to me. "Watson, do you recall the story of the speckled band? A snake sent through a ventilator. This is a variation on that theme, but infinitely more subtle. There was no snake here. There was something smaller, faster, and just as deadly." He fixed his gaze back on the silent Indian. "You knew that the box contained a spring-loaded mechanism. You also knew that there was a tiny, almost invisible hole in the wall behind the wainscoting, drilled years ago for a bell pull that was never installed. From the rose garden outside, under the cover of darkness, you inserted a long, thin, needle-like rod through that hole. With infinite patience, you pushed the rod across the room until its tip rested against a hidden catch on the back of the cigar box. When the time was right, after Jennings had delivered the brandy and the door was bolted, you applied pressure. The catch was released. The lid of the box did not fly open. Instead, a tiny aperture, no bigger than a pinhead, opened on the side facing the colonel's chair, and from that aperture shot a tiny poisoned dart. "A poisoned dart," I gasped. "Precisely. A dart tipped with a powerful, fast-acting alkaloid poison." The colonel would have felt a sharp sting in his neck or hand, a moment of confusion, and then darkness. The poison would induce symptoms similar to a massive heart failure, but you could not be sure. The gunshot was to mask the true cause of death. But how to fire the gun? Holmes's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. For that, you had another ingenious device. A simple length of black silk thread, almost invisible in the dim light. One end was attached to the trigger of the revolver, which you had somehow managed to place in the colonel's lap on a previous visit, perhaps while posing as a servant, or with Armitage's unwitting help. The other end of the thread ran up the chimney. You waited an hour, perhaps two, to ensure the poison had done its work. Then, from the roof, you gave a sharp tug on the thread. The gun fired. The thread, being silk, would have burned away instantly in the residual heat of the flue. The gun falls to the floor. The perfect suicide. A man shot through the temple in a room locked and bolted from the inside. It was a breathtaking reconstruction, at once fantastic and terrifyingly plausible. "But you overlooked one thing," Holmes concluded. "The recoil from your tug on the thread, however slight, was enough to vibrate the desk. And the cigar box, which you had pushed slightly off balance with your rod, shifted. It moved from the center of the blotter to the corner of the desk. That was your fatal error, the displaced box. It was the one thing you could not explain away, the tiny grain of sand that wrecked your perfect machine." Sanjay finally broke his silence. A low, guttural laugh escaped his twisted lips. "You are a devil, Englishman," he rasped. "A veritable devil. You see everything. Yes, it is all true. I killed him. I killed him for my father, and I would do it again." At that moment we heard the heavy tread of boots on the stairs. Holmes had evidently summoned the police before our arrival. The door opened, and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood on the threshold, flanked by two burly constables. "Got your message, Mr. Holmes?" he said, his sharp little eyes taking in the scene. "Seems you've wrapped it all up for us, as usual. Who's our man?" "The gentleman in the corner, Inspector," Holmes said, gesturing towards Sanjay. "Sanjay, son of the man, a drumhead court-martial wrongly executed at Kandahar. The charge is murder. And," he added, with a nod towards the cowering Armitage, "I would hold this fellow as an accessory. His cowardice and greed paved the way for the crime." As the constables led the two men away, Lestrade clapped Holmes on the shoulder. "A locked room, eh? We'd have been scratching our heads over this one for months. You've done a fine night's work, Mr. Messimes. Holmes merely shrugged, his features once more composed into a mask of languid indifference, the fire of the chase now extinguished. "It was a pretty little problem," he remarked, "and it has saved me from a week of ennui. Come, Watson. Mrs. Hudson will have some coffee waiting for us, and the night is still young. There is the matter of a certain monograph on the polyphonic motets of Lassus, which I am anxious to finish." As we made our way back through the sleeping city, the rain finally ceasing and a few pale stars appearing between the scudding clouds, I reflected on the incredible chain of reasoning that had led us from a tearful young woman in our sitting room to the grim confession in that East End garret. Once again I was struck by the vast and curious store of knowledge, the razor-sharp intellect, and the profound understanding of the dark complexities of the human heart that made my friend Sherlock Holmes the most remarkable man I had ever known. The unseen hand that had struck down Colonel Carruthers had been guided by a burning desire for vengeance, but it had been laid bare by the pure, cold light of reason.